and welcome to 2022 NaPoWriMo, the podcast. I am your host, Bex Sherwood, speaking like a robot. Thank you so much for joining in with us today as we enter April, National Poetry Writing Month. But before we get into all of that, I will be your host, your guide through the mystical writing journey that is NaPoWriMo. And I am joined by some helpful friends, the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, and the other one, Tin Man. You can all align yourselves to which role you feel is best. Give it up for Kev, Katie, and Mark. Yay!
I'm the lion, right?
I don't have a heart, so I'm
I had always associated myself more with the flying monkeys personally. But...
Does that make you Dorothy, Bex? That's cool. How come you get to be Dorothy?
She has a Toto.
I do have Toto.
So
yeah, I suppose I am Dorothy, and in this Wizard of Oz scenario, the wizard is 5 beautifully written poems in form. So we're gonna, for the uninitiated, NaPoWriMo, or National Poetry Writing Month, is celebrated in the month of April and has been since 2003, where it was created by a poet in Washington, D.C. She set herself the challenge of writing a new poem every day and shared her journey online, and thus NaPoWriMo was born. We have not been doing NaPoWriMo since 2003, but we have been doing it over the last couple of years, and we're happy to be doing it again. Yeah, it's a great project. It's a great fun thing to do, and you should all write with your pals and write along with us because we're your pals.
It's the thing I like about poetry is it started off sounding like someone, I'm going to write a poem every day for this whole day, and really I'm like, someone's actually just gone, right, look, I need work, so I'm going to write every day until someone buys the thing. Like, it's just someone that recently went freelance, the first freelance poet in the new millennium.
I've done NaPoWriMo every day. It's a stupid thing.
Yeah, it is. It's quite difficult. So. Yeah. Well, so back in 2020, in the beginning times, we all got together and decided a great thing to do over the 3 months of lockdown that we were going to have was to get involved in NaPoWriMo in a big way, get all of you guys to write along with us, and we were going to produce 30 poems across 30 days in April and share our journey, share that journey with you all. And we have done. There is a series that you can watch of our struggling through 2020 podcast, NaPoWriMo podcast. I'm going to call it the podcast, even though I think Kev doesn't like it.
That makes Perry Glenda, the good witch who shows up in the first act and pisses.
Oh my God.
You mean Glinda? You just call her Glenda?
I'm pretty sure it's good.
It's an old movie. I don't remember. He's the good witch. It works. It fits.
And poetry is the house that crushes her.
Doing great at staying on track here.
That's fine. There is only one track, and that track is poetry. So back in 2020, we did NaPoWriMo. We wrote a poem every day. 2 different levels of success, but overall, we all got 30 poems out of it. And then 2021 came around. That's already a long 3 weeks. And we were back at April again going, I haven't really used any of these poems that I wrote before. So we decided, because who are we if not those who dissuade tradition, and to do 5 poems in 5 weeks, and using the framework of our Return to Form series. And they're also available on our YouTube channel, where we pair poets and match poets together, give them the same prompt and form, and ask them to produce wonderful pieces of work. And that's very much what we're all going to do over the next 5 weeks.
I'm just saying there's a reason we hired other poets.
Yeah. Well, Mark and I were also poets that you hired for...
True.
That's very true. That is actually very true.
I meant it more as a reflection of my ability to churn out a beautiful piece of work.
That's true.
It did get a lot easier after we went from every day to once a week.
Massively.
Yeah.
I think it's a better way to do it.
That's my pro tip.
You can still write every day, and that's supposed to be the point. I just think we do it this way because, like, the pieces you would get when you do it every day tend to be much shorter, tend to be kind of more, I know we're using form, but I guess like more formal and stuff. And like, I'm interested in generating pieces that I can use in performance. And I think doing it every day, I didn't generate a lot of those pieces. Whereas when we switched to doing it once a week, but like still writing every day, still working on a piece all that time, I think that was I got more as an end product. So yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we're just trying to give everyone who's writing that detail that it isn't normally Harry Baker doesn't sit down over a 12-hour period and bust out a pamphlet. Like, it's a lot of craft goes into it. There might be a lot of research that you do. I mean, Harry might.
Crazy.
That was a bad example. Harry's
Yeah.
a psychopath. But like other poets, normally you would spend a few days, weeks looking at different parts of the poem, editing, researching.
All three of you have pamphlets. Yeah.
Can I just, on writing in a day, the Harry Baker story for the madman that Harry is, we asked Harry to write a contrapuntal poem, right, which is written, it can be read in different directions and stuff like that. And he responded to the email request with a contrapuntal poem of like, yes, I will do this. Harry's wild.
But if you are not Harry Baker, as so many of us are,
I love it.
Writing a poem in a day is, it's difficult. It might mean that the work that you do create, as we found, we all had 30 poems. And I think last year we discussed this, that we really didn't do a lot with any. Obviously, it was a pandemic. There weren't a lot of opportunities, but they weren't pieces that we found ourselves drawn to revisit, rework, or invest a lot of time in, because we hadn't invested a lot of time in them to write them in the first place. So this way, 5 poems, 5 weeks, we have plenty of time to do whatever research, discussion, playing around that we want to do. We've got a bit of framework coming from our fabulous forms, and then we're also held massively accountable, because we all have to get together and share our poems. And if you don't have one, oh boy, that would be fun.
The judgment will be harsh.
It will be definitely harsh. So I'm gonna
You can think of nothing
now.
else to do, eh?
Yeah, if you're busy, scrap that. It's April. Let's
Guys,
go.
there's no live event this month. Sorry. Yeah.
No, there is though. We telling the people. We telling the people that they'll get confused.
We'll tell
There's a
you
live
all
event.
about. We'll tell you all about our next live events at the end of the episode. Ooh. Just if you're gonna keep on hanging for those plugs, Katie, save me by. Would you please share? I asked you to bring a poem along from last year's NaPoWriMo. Would you be willing to fill us in a little bit on that poem and read that for us today?
I would
now
be.
Here. Great.
So yeah, I mean, as we were saying, I really liked the model that we used last year and that we're going to be using again this year, of doing a poem every week, because I felt like in 2020, we wrote every day for 30 days and I got maybe 5 poems that I still use, but they're all quite short. Whereas last year it was, I got 5 poems, all of which I still use, and they're longer and more deeply considered, and I think better. So that was quite nice, and I'm really excited to do it again. And so, yeah, Bex, you asked us to bring along a NaPoWriMo poem of the past. And I went back to last year. We've been working on a project this year for Edinburgh City of Literature and Historic Environment Scotland that will be debuting at some point soon. We'll be sharing all of the details on our socials, but essentially it's celebrating historic female writers of Edinburgh, which has been amazing to research and look into the lives of these women. And so, of course, looking into the lives of kick-ass female writers of the past made me remember dirtbag male writers of the past. So I'm gonna share the golden shovel that I wrote using a bit of Percy Shelley's work. And I've been thinking a lot as well about sort of about how we engage with problematic writers. And obviously this is a much more in-depth conversation than we can have here, but how do we talk about writers who were trash people in many ways? And one of the best ways that I like doing that is through poetry and through sort of found poetry or golden shovels or other forms of poetry where you take a bit of text from that writer and you respond to it in some way, or you cut it up and mash it up. So found poetry, spoiler alert, is one of the forms that we're going to be using this month. So I'm really excited to see what we do for that. And golden shovels are kind of a similar thing. So basically the way that a golden shovel works is you take a bit of someone else's poem and you use the words of their poem as the end words to each line of your poem, so that you could read their text down the end lines of your new piece. I used a particularly flirty bit of one of Percy Shelley's poems, so I'll just read that bit for you now so that you can see my source material. Ugh, I hate him. See the mountains kiss high heaven, and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth, if thou kiss not me? A lot of people think he's a great writer. I think he has one good poem, and he's a piece of crap. Which was a problem when I had to teach him at university level. Anyway.
Come on, get off the fence, Kate. Tell us what you
Yeah,
really
right. So yeah, only background that you really need for this poem. He was married to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein and is a way better writer than he is. Hey, and he claimed to be a radical because he believed in free love, which, yeah, we can have a whole conversation about what that means. But what it actually meant was that he was an arsehole to his wife. And she went through a lot of awful scenarios in her life, and he was not present for them. So this is a golden shovel. Sorry for the very long introduction. This is a golden shovel responding to Percy Shelley. Oh, fuck off, Percy, you hypocrite. I see through these rhyming pickup lines, the ABAB cliches in which flirty mountains tickle the sky, designed to elicit a kiss from whichever naive teenager your high ass is chasing this week. Heaven forbid you write to your wife. You and Byron pioneered this twisted shtick, the gorgeous, tortured poet with the tousled waves, claiming he's a hardcore feminist, just to clasp his nagging hands round the waists of one wide-eyed waif after another, a parade for your ego. Someone has to say no. I'm sick of you shagging your sister-in-law and calling it the blossoming flower of revolution. You're not the radical you would claim to be. History might have forgiven you if you were just another horny asshole, if you didn't make it a manifesto, didn't call it equality for all. But recall, you disdained to stay when the birthing bed gaped its bloody maw, your consequences wailing, a brother and two sisters who barely breathed and were gone. It should haunt you. Mary sits alone in the filthy kitchen, watching sunlight eke its tragic path across damp tiles, and clasps her swollen womb, feeling the hollow echo of loss, knowing the earth rolls on without her, and you roll onto another bed, the treacherous blue moonbeams illuminating each illicit kiss. Is this how you set her free? The scholars say she cradled your hard heart after the sea silenced you. She kept what beat for others locked in her desk for decades. Is this the love you mean? All her remaining days she stayed in this solitary matrimony, a bittersweet rebuttal to your life's work. So what was your free love worth, Percy? And who paid? Because if this is how you spent it, whispering, "Thou art mine," to strangers for the thrill of a forbidden kiss, but not sticking around to mourn your kids, that's not love, believe me.
Katie, that's so good. Oh,
Yeah, great poet. I'm a big fan.
But what does it
It's some
mean?
fantastic work.
But what,
There's no
what do
better
you
way.
think she thinks about?
there's no better way to tell a poet to fuck off than to write better than them. And that's just
I thought you were going to say that to tell them to fuck off in a poem. I mean, both have been achieved.
You know what I mean? Just to like straight up outright them is like a strong this is a strong attack.
Why did I start with Katie?
Poetic justice, if you will.
But I think it's interesting because what you were saying about like, I was chatting to a group of like a writers group on a Zoom call last week, and I was doing kind of like rapid fire tips, right, for performance. And one of the things I said was like, your intro should be shorter than your poem, right? And like, but that poem requires a level of context.
Yeah.
That's why it's not probably a great poem for a set. That could be a piece in a show or a larger talk or, you know, TED Talk style or whatever, but it doesn't fit in your, hey, here's your tight 15, right?
And that's the thing. Yeah. Cause I actually haven't performed that one live at all, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do it here.
Specific.
Because you have to, either your audience has to know about Percy Shelley, which, I mean, some people do, some people don't, like, and probably they don't know the entire history of how he treated his wife because they don't teach that at uni, understandably. So yeah, it's really interesting because I love writing pieces like that require a lot of context, but equally, I hate it when writers are performing and they have really reference heavy work that they just don't explain. And I never want to do that to an audience, but it means that piece takes a lot of time to set up. So it's interesting what works in sets and
you know, like it really works in this environment, right? When you're like as an explanation for a piece of work and stuff, and like you can explain a lot with that poem, right? That would be a great poem to like workshop out and be like, okay, well, this is how you do referential material. This is how you play with a form and how you pair those things together. This is how you can read a form poem not in its form, like because you read that in a very specific way where you can't tell where the line ends are, right? And like you could use that piece to do a lot with, to like be like, this is how you examine, you know, a piece of real life history and contextualize that into something else. Like there's so many aspects to that, but yeah, it doesn't necessarily work for what your primary focus for generating pieces of work are, but they're good things to have.
Yeah Thanks.
I thought it was brilliant.
That makes it sound like I was
No, that's supposed to be. I mean, I don't have a better way of describing the thing. Like I fully admit, I didn't know they were married to Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. That was very cool. I have learned today, which is amazing. But yeah, like it's a cracking poem. I think Kev, it's very right in the, in the stuff that we write from some NaPoWriMo stuff, or from just writing in general. Like it doesn't always then not make it into the set, but not everything always gets performed. Like
not everything is good for performance.
You know, like
one thing that I think is very understated part of it that I really, really like, and it's, you know, when people do kind of responses, often the impulse is to reply in your style, right? To take their thing and like mix it up and do your thing. Whereas your language is very of that romantic period, right? Of like
I tried to incorporate some of it.
Like it's a very like, because you're the source text is flirtatious, right? Like you said, it's flirtatious. And so a lot of your words in there are very like, you know, they pair with that kind of romantic vibe. Lots of like, I don't know why it's in my head, but L's and I's and S's, right? It's like that there's almost this sort of like hissing call to it, right? It's just interesting that I like that, like aesthetically pairing to what they do, because I think it's a stronger fuck you, because it is like, and you're also not very good at what you do, so I'm gonna demonstrate, even though that's not really what I do. It's nice.
No one is ever going to hire me to teach romantic poetry again, which I'm kind of okay with. I prefer contemporary, so that's hey ho.
That's ideal. I mean, this is the thing with like a golden shovel and some of the other forms. While they are forms of poetry, they don't necessarily sound it when you read them, though they can do, but it's different. I think that's the reason I love form. I've really like gotten into form over the last couple of years from doing Return to Form from NaPoWriMo last year. I tended to write stuff that was in form before I knew what forms were, lots of like list poems and letters and things like that in different quirky styles. and I don't tend to write from my own narrative as well, which really helps with a lot of these forms where there is such a rigid structure and you have to do so much rhyme in certain ways or meter in certain ways, that it gives you that a bit more rigidity, rather than when you're writing that sort of golden shovel, you're giving yourself different restrictions from what might be in, you know, there's no restriction when writing a golden shovel to be like, and you need to write it as if it was in the source material, and you need to make sure it's a certain length, or you need to do this or that,
I think
or whatever.
when you get that heavy structure, like form structure, what it forces you to do is be more selective in your language, and therefore like pushes the boundaries of creativity, right? It forces you to explain a thing in a way that you wouldn't naturally. Like the way I often write my like freeform stuff, it's like very flow of consciousness, right? I just try and get into a beat of rhyming and try and aim for what I'm looking to say, and those two things kind of, you know, wiggle their way to the point. Whereas you can't do that with form. You have to very be like, this is what I want to say, and I'd have this many beats, or this, you know, this specific vowel, right? Like whatever that real trapping is. So I can see that it's like puzzle solving rather than kind of like stream of consciousness writing. It's very different.
Yeah. Shout out quickly to Mark, who we have a video of that poem on the channel, and Mark voices Shelley, which I very much appreciated.
I knew that poem sounded really familiar. I was like, why do I remember? Why do I know this off the top? Why do I know this verse of this thing off the top? That's why. That's why.
And we, as well, if you guys are interested in golden shovels and you want to check them out, we do have a workshop on them. And because they were part of Return to Form Season 1, we have great poems by Tawana Sitole and Rachel Amy that are golden shovels. Actually, all the poems I think that we're sharing today, we've got great examples on the channel. So yeah, do go check those out.
Give me my God Save the Queen one, and I love that poem.
It's a really good. It's such a great poem. Well,
you. I think it's a dislike on the channel, which is a personal exactly. Wow. Which is what you were, because that's what you got. That's what you. There's your different fuck you.
That's
right?
Victory. Like, that's victory. I think that's part of the beauty of doing NaPoWriMo in this way, is that, you know, because we only get 5 poems, but because we've had a lot longer to sort of craft and think about them, we have managed to use them in a number of ways. So Katie, obviously you didn't get to perform the golden shovel piece because it requires explanation and context and things like that, which is fine, because that is what is important to a piece. So it makes a great piece for like a show like this or something like that. But Kev, I know that you have performed one of the pieces that you wrote for NaPoWriMo last year. Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Weirdly, out of the 5, I've actually performed 2, which I think is a pretty good ratio, right? Like if you're you know, that's a month's work. I got 2 that got on the set. The God Save the Queen one, I opened our Fringe with, and I was like, because I did it, and then I was like, yeah, that's right. I like to cut the audience in half right away, and it was like everyone had a good time with it. It was all good. But one that has like filtered into my set proper, like I really enjoy doing it. It's one that I'm like really proud of, and I think it like, it's a nice, it fits my style of a more kind of free form flowing, you know, Shane Koizan ripoff, right? It's more that, but then it's also, you know, technically in a form, which is quite fun. I did it at our shows a bunch. I did it our most recent live event there in March, and I did it during Fringe and stuff. But like I got to do it down in London. We were doing some work for Glenfiddich. Katie wrote an amazing poem, and we did like a really cool video for it. Me and Mark and Perry were working on that, and it came out really nice. You can find it. We've got links or whatever somewhere. There'll be a link in the YouTube maybe. And so like we did that, and when they brought me down to London to do some gigs down there for Burns, and so I was doing Lascaux as part of that set. And it was just, yeah, I really liked the poem, so I'm going to read that one if that's all right. So Lascaux is a cave in France. And it was found by like some young guys way back in the 40s, well, around the Second World War, and they found this beautiful cave with all these stunning ancient cave paintings, including these images of hands, these sort of negative images where you put your hand on the rock and blow sort of pigment dye around it to create this negative image, amongst animals and all this crazy stuff. And they were so awed by it, they like camped out there and protected it. And then eventually, it became like a tourist destination, and there's a whole other story where it became Lascaux 2, where they built an exact replica because the lights were damaging the original. So like next door, there's an exact replica of the cave. Fascinating place. But yeah, this is the thing that captured me was the hands. Walk in the dark, and it's only soil and stone. Call out and hear only your own echoing tone. This inhospitable hole is the furthest thing from a home. Musty air that swirls with dust, tunnels strewn with bones. This place is old, but so are we. And all we ever needed was the light to see. Flickering flame casts a glow that travels back to the fear of the pack, the bite of the cold, the warmth of the gathering, the joy of a story told. Fire stretches its fingers, and black walls flood with color. The collected effort of generations, an art installation 17,000 years in the making, a painstaking effort in a time so hard to survive. No reward in mind, just a way to say we were alive. Or perhaps there was a purpose, a guide to the flora and fauna that could hurt us, lessons too painful to trust to words spoken. A hall of bulls might simply be the symbol of a single heart broken. Maybe they're a map, a plan of attack, the animals easiest to track, time spent now, but with full-bellied interest later paid back. There is no way of knowing for sure, but these are not the images that act as Lascaux's lure. It is the hands. They are reaching, grasping, pulling directly from the past, the red pigment blasted absence of a person's pressed palm upon the rock. The thought that you can touch the stone face and place yourself in the exact space of someone so unrecognizable, someone who died before history had begun, but who felt compelled for some memory to be held long after they were gone. How could that be anything but humbling? How could you still your hands from trembling? Would your mind flash to a nursery class of 21st century children, placing painted palms on paper later to be displayed not on cave walls, but magnet held to family refrigerators? Would you still see unfathomable distance? Or would you finally understand there's only ever been an arm's reach between us? There you go. And that was a
Love
concrete
that
poem.
piece.
Yeah, it was a concrete poem. So what I did was I just wrote that poem, and then I put my hand on it and cut out the middle. I was like, there's your poem. Concrete.
I was about to give you all the kudos for going. It takes real skill to read that poem and be able to perform that multiple times. Like, and that's a concrete poem. Ha ha!
I love it though. I mean, because like as much as we can joke about like you wrote a poem and then cut something out of it and we're like concrete, like it does work so brilliantly with the theme of the poem and with this negative imagery and the idea of what we remove and what remains, and like sort of thematically and philosophically with the poem. It works
because I did it in
very
reverse.
well.
I thought, like, I saw that image and was like, oh, I'm gonna write, like, I did think it wasn't like oh, now I could do that with it. And like the whole poem only came about because I thought of a handprint would be good. That I'd seen a video on like Kurzagat or whatever however it's pronounced, which was like I just watched it and I was like, oh, that image would be great. So that was the first thing I thought of, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of concrete poems are written with the filling of that space. So a negative space is a really nice like kind of contrast to it. And the fact that that kind of removes some of the actual text of the poem when you look at the physical piece is quite like artful and interesting.
Well, I thought it was a nice pairing of the idea of like we see these beautiful images, but we don't really understand why they're there, right? Like that's a central issue. Is like it was a brutal time. Like you barely made enough to like continue to exist. Why exert all this energy and difficulty when you've got rudimentary tools to paint on these cave walls? Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
What is the purpose to that? Is it, some lesson to teach, or is it just purely to be like, we were here? And I just found that fascinating. And then it's the things you miss, right? Like I saw an update on Lascaux, which was a lot of the images like overlap and like are seem like they've been drawn over, even though other areas in the cave are like blank. You're like, why would they do that? It's because we've always looked at it with electric lights. if you put flame in there, like a torch flame, then the overlapping images in the shadow seem to move. And it's, you know what I mean, like this beautiful idea that we totally missed and didn't understand and thought was some stupid mistake. And so I thought that really paired well with the idea of like, if you see the, you know, if I ever publish this poem, you wouldn't be able to read it. Like it's, I think there's a kind of joy to that. And that fits with my own personal thing about like, you know, how I feel about publishing poems and how they exist in a spoken space, because I can convey that emotionally and with the tone and tempo and stuff of the poem and the movement of the piece in a way that I can't necessarily convey on the page, other than removing a big chunk of the understanding of the actual point, which is interesting.
Yeah.
One thing I love about form is just it expands your ability to play so much and takes it beyond the text and beyond the performance and gives it a whole new dimension. And it's amazing.
Yeah. And absolutely, if you're writing at home and you want to use some of the frameworks of a form, but then decide you want to go off track of it, that is totally fine. No one is the poetry police aren't going to show up at your house and be like, this Sistina is wrong. Like, it's fine. Having said that, the four of us very much do need to keep to the form because it will be being judged.
That's the point in like, you know, people talk about like spoken word not using form, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
Spoken word writers write in free form, which is an amalgamation, a use of any particular form at any particular moment.
Yeah.
That's the point. Like it is, you know, look at any spoken word poet, there will be pieces of rhyme, you know, there will be, like I mentioned him earlier, right? Khoisan. He doesn't write in any particular structured form, but there is tons of rhyme. There is tons of assonance and consonants. There's tons of like repeated phrases and like there's a huge amount of borrowed form in there.
Yeah. Just because you're not using a received form doesn't mean that you're not using elements of form.
Or like the ones you first mentioned that you got into, Bex, right? Like that sort of letter poem. That's a very loose idea of form. That's more of a prompt, but like it's a, you know, it works for like that spoken word form, right? It's almost a thing in and of itself when you're like list poems, letter poems, these kind of like response tos and like, you know, things like that. It becomes its own. You look at Golden Shovel, it only happens because one person does it and other people like it, and then that becomes a form rather than someone absolutely breaking form and doing their own thing. It's like, it's weird.
That's even with that, with the Golden Shovel, in terms of like your delivery from it, you could deliver it, I suppose, like deliver, like this is where you've got like written form, but not necessarily like, I suppose, spoken form, because you could deliver a Golden Shovel where you kind of like have your beat or your pause at that end line of it, or you can do it the more performative spoken word way, as Katie did, where you say you couldn't tell what those end words were, so you could go up, do that poem, and then be like, haha, I got you, Golden Shovel about this stuff while I've got you. You know?
It's an annoying thing for me. A poet recently said to me, I like the sound of the poem, not my performance of it. And I was like, I have an issue with that, because like, to me, those things are different. Like, it's why I don't really like reading poetry. I like hearing poetry, because it would be to me like going, okay, we've invented music and that's incredible, and now we figured out a way to write it down so other people can share it and understand it. So now we're going to get rid of all the all the live music. You're like, the written bit was so we could share poems more widely. So if you didn't have access to the person who wrote it and the sound they made with it, it was a way of like getting as close as you could to the sound of their poem in a way that you would understand it. And that's how like writing developed, right? That's why like pieces of punctuation create sound and impact, because it was the want to convey the spoken to a wider audience. But now we can like do that with the way it is spoken. And so to suggest that like the poem has its own intrinsic sound beyond the sound that you have made it had, and that a reader can possibly understand that sound entirely as you do, without it being in such a structured form that it kind of lacks that spontaneity and creativity, especially in free form, I think is what's the point? Like it doesn't equate.
Well, when I wrote my pamphlet, that's fair. No, when I wrote my pamphlet, Poetry for Cows, where obviously I share a collection of different topics and forms and writings, I made it so that there are pieces in there that are not performable. I mean, admittedly, I did do my eye test for cows at the last show, which was hilarious, just to get like 80 people mooing at me. It was I had the great time. But there's, there are some poems that are in that are written specifically to only be read as a written poem. And I think that's a different thing, because it's not designed to be read in my voice, in the same way that I wrote sonnets last year and I really liked the sonnet. I'm going to share my 2021 sonnet, but that's easier to convey in writing because sonnet is such a structured form. There is a literal way that you need to write a sonnet for it to be read, for it to count as a sonnet. I'm really annoyed whenever anyone shares like a haiku or a sonnet or something on like one of the Facebook pages that I'm on, and it's not a sonnet, it's not a haiku. I'm like, you got it wrong. But poetry, but then I'm also the one going, well, you should break whatever rules you want to. So
it's that thing. I do find that kind of poetry fairly exclusionary, because it relies on your understanding to know what that should sound like.
Yeah, 100%.
And that just seems like a little like you're putting a lot of work on the reader for me. Whereas like I see the work I do is like, I always talk about it. The big difference for me is like people think spoken word poems are less something because they're not informed or whatever. And I'm like, you have the time the poem is happening, literally the moments it is being said, for it to be understood and like retained. That is a different skill. You are writing a different way to achieve that. And I'm like, I see the onus on me to make my poem understandable to as many people as I possibly can. Like Kate was talking about referential stuff. To not make references that aren't so ubiquitous that everyone in the audience is going to fairly understand them, right? Like things like that. Whereas page poets are like, you don't understand the iambic pentameter? Well, I'm afraid you can't read my poem. And you're like, all right, cool, no worries.
I think ultimately it's about the spectrum, and there's everything. I try to play peacemaker and get shot down.
Nope.
There's everything from concrete poetry to sound poetry. And I think often we frame it as combative, and you're like, no, it's about dipping your finger in as many pies as you want and baking all the pies. And
I like both, like I said, but that's where I come to the thing where it's like you get something like a golden shovel and it's like the form informs, right? The form becomes the purpose behind the poem. It becomes an integral part. And that makes up for something that you lose that you get on the page, because no sane person would read a golden shovel like a golden shovel. Like that would often become really tedious. And so you're like, so the sound of the poem's a lie. Like, what does that mean then? Like, I don't understand it.
Poetry is a lie. Bex, do you want to read another lie?
Yeah, I think after all of that, I'm going to read a sonnet that I wrote to be written down. So I wrote this last year. It is part of a collection of sonnets that I am still writing, but I have done a bit of work on it, a little, of stories of Henry VIII's wives as retold via a Shakespearean sonnet. He did not invent them, but whatever. Shakespearean sonnet. And this is the one I wrote for Anne Boleyn. So it's a lot shorter than everyone else's poems, which is why I really like certain forms that have limitations on length. At matrimony's end our tales begin, and though I stood with grace and poise polite, I awaited judgment from the king. With me he took particular delight. Together we would have a happy life. I promised to deliver him an heir, but first he had to get rid of his wife. She took the news with anger and despair. For 7 years we toiled to see this done, and through the years our love was turned to hate. I could not keep my promise of a son. Without one I now meet a darker fate. There are no people in such poisoned hands than dwellers of those green and pleasant lands. That's my sonnet, and it's a sonnet.
I love it so much. I as well, not to go back to the thing of references and twisting, but I think I remember saying this when you first shared this with us. I love that you end on green and pleasant lands, and that notion being England and, how we sort of idealize it, but then there are no such poisoned hands as those green and pleasant lands for the volta, which is meant to be the part of the sonnet that twists it. Like, but then again, you're like, well, even if you don't know anything about how a sonnet is supposed to work, that's seamless and it's fine. And you can just hear that as a poem. You don't need to know that it's a sonnet. You don't need to know anything about the history of the sonnet. It just works and is awesome. So
I like it a lot. I really enjoy the The thing about sonnets is like that restriction of line to tell such a large story as you're telling there, right? Like that whole relationship, it makes you really, I think, use words that would be hyperbolic in like more contemporary, like free form, you know, I'm talking about my everyday life, you know, kind of.
Yeah.
And when like there's a real joy to that because it lets you really tap into an era or a time frame. Similar to what I was saying about Kate's with like the sort of romantic language and stuff. There's something very regal to the sonnet that fits the theme, and I enjoy when you can do that with a piece of form. Like you can like bring these trappings into it, use the form to enhance something performative, right? If it's going to be such a pronounced form, especially like a sonnet where there is this very rigid reading rhythm, to then do something like, you know, monarchist history is like it fits.
Yeah. Oh, so good.
Mark, have you got any compliments for me?
Oh, probably somewhere. I was just like, the monarchy keeps coming up a bunch.
Yeah, it's weird.
But no, I mean, I really enjoyed how much, and like these other folks said, how much you dived into form and other things as well, from the start, and also the areas you started drawing from. And I like, from someone that really still tolerates form, let's go with, like
these past couple of years have been tough on you, haven't
tolerate.
they?
I see its benefits, sure. But it's really nice to be able to like to see a nice woven, to see, like say, like that short form being used to tell a longer story in that sort of short burst of thing, in a very written form used to tell a very spoken word, kind of that abridgedness of it. And I think it's a really nice marriage of the two. So, you know, it's good on the theme of like, again, like Kate was saying about like, you know, like these like women in history and stuff like that. There's like going, yeah, there was a lot of douchebags like male wise back there. There we go. Bring in some good women's stories.
It's funny though, because a lot of the sonnets I see for such a short form, and like again, it's truly you, Bex, as well, are like trying to say something huge, like in a very condensed way. You know what I mean? It's an interesting, and I guess I see the inclination to do it, because like if you're going to write something so concise and constrained, like that's the challenge, right? Say something really big with it. I really like, and I've spoken your guys' ears off about this, but I'm going to mention it again. Me and Gallie were shooting Winchester Poetry Festival last year, and I was working on some of the videos and looking at it, and like it was Patience Agbabi who did this set, and like she closed with this beautiful crown sonnet, which is like a where you take 15 sonnets, and so the last line of each sonnet becomes the first line of the next sonnet, and then the first 14 sonnets end lines become the 15 lines of the final verse. And it's a staggering piece of writing, and to keep that coherence and talk about such a big, because like once you get into a sonnet, you're kind of pleased that it's only 15 lines, right? Because when you start writing, you're like, oh man, this is a slog. So when you get to the end, you're like, cool, that's boom. Whereas trying to continue that story and talk about something and keep that rhythm, it's almost like endurance form writing, which I was, as soon as I saw her do it, I was like, I'd be so interested to try that despite my hatred of sonnets.
Yeah, a crown sonnet is sort of like one of the stretch goals for me at some point. I feel like it's hard, and I am not there yet as a writer, but I aspire to be.
Well, see, that's where
I think it could make an amazing spoken word piece is the thing,
Yeah.
because I think sonnets are very short, but if you could do something like that, that's, you know, then going to be about 4 minutes long or whatever, that would be great. And the kind of repeating refrains coming through, and then that big climax in the last crescendo sonnet would be like, oh yeah, Gallie, sorry. No,
well, I was just gonna say, because it's interesting going back with like Kate said, like not there as the artist then, but it also like what Kev said about, because I think it's the thing of doing like, obviously free form is, you know, there are no rules, which means there's all this extra thing. But with form, there's then, you know, those rules often end up being restrictive, but in helpful ways. But whereas like these big massive crown sonnet things, not to sound disparate to the thing, these huge like mega forms sound almost like going, well, I did 1,000-piece puzzle, like that's amazing, but like could the puzzle, it's still the same picture in 4 pieces. You know, like, you know, I appreciate long epic poetry, but you know, attention spans in it, you know.
Not every poem should be, not every concept should be a crown sonnet. Like it's about how form mirrors function.
For example, that piece Patience was doing was part of a wider project where she was a artist involved speaking to a refugee, and so it was her she also highlighted the importance for them to share their stories as specifically refugees being heard, that this specific project was to take their stories and turn them into pieces of art. And so it is her relaying a conversation she had with a refugee, and how from her sort of growing up to the coming here and all that stuff. And it's that's where I think it really adds to it, because it is a piece that you want to continue through, and there is this long story going through it that you never lose your attention in it. And the form helps, because you feel this refreshing beat every so many bars. It's really interesting. Well, I don't know if that's ever going to go out. If it does, we'll share it. Don't you worry.
Probably. I'm sure it will.
Eventually. One day.
Look for patience. Find patience like Bobby.
There'll be a link somewhere. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure everyone's really delighted to hear that as part of this podcast series, we will not be writing a crown sonnet, or even a regular sonnet. That was so last year.
2023, baby. Let's do it.
Yeah, right. But while we're still trudging through the murky depths of 2022, I think it's time we talk about what we're doing this week. So we've obviously had our huge rants about poetry. We'll be back next Sunday doing more poetry rants, but also sharing our poems from the first form that we are writing, the Villanelle. Now, I need
a Mark poem. Mark hasn't done his poem.
Mark is going to share a Villanelle that he has written with us.
Shut up, Kev.
Ruining that perfect segue, Mr. Mclean.
So how about Mr. Gallie? Everyone is held accountable. Kevin, you should know this. So I don't know what's the best way. Mark, do you want to share your poem first, and then we'll talk a little bit more in depth about a Villanelle?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was like, I brought the Villanelle because I didn't write the Villanelle last year because it wasn't one of the poem forms that we did. I wrote it I wrote it in the 2021, which was sort of weird for me to look back at that and go, oh, I wrote quite an interesting and a bit more sort of an intricate form before I was forced to.
Extracurricular Villanelle, well done.
As well, because it sort of goes into what I quite like, what we've done like with these ones. Is obviously like if you're writing every day for NaPoWriMo, good, well done, you shine on, you beautiful diamond. I enjoyed when we did it that day. Obviously, different times, everyone's circumstances are different. But I found when it was that year doing like a poem every day, it made me feel more anxious about missing a day than actually getting something good on the page. And so that was why it was interesting for me, because the Villanelle I wrote on, because they're all titled by days. So it's day 22. And I'm like, well, that's quite late into it for me to have got. I must have been really running out of ideas.
I think that's what we both started writing in form quite late towards the end of NaPoWriMo 2020, because we'd run out of ideas and we were living in a shoebox.
Because I was like, because I also with form, like I don't like have like many intrinsic issues with form. When I'm trying to write with form, my first question is, why am I using that form? Is how does that fit and how does that work? In the same way, before I start writing, I didn't used to do this, and I hate that I do it now. I start going, why are you writing this? What is the point? Like literally that thing of like, why? Like, who is it for? Is it for someone? Is it for something else? And even that just changes quite a lot. But I like the sort of like the stories of someone that was tell. So I felt Villanelle is quite late in the day for as a brief aside from because I end up with that panic of missing a day, wrote quite a lot of haikus, said the quote, because just my little public safety point. The safety, no one's going to be attacked by haiku, but the haiku as we kind of know it, or as a lot of people as Western use, isn't actually a haiku, because a haiku needs to have like an element about seasons. Typically it's actually what people call the haiku would be more classified as a senryu. I apologize if I've messed up that pronunciation, but I imagine the part of the pronunciation is going, oh well, haiku is easier for some folks. Senryu. So I wrote a bunch of them.
Not just 575.
No, there's more.
We've westernized the concept quite a lot.
So that's just my little bit to try and bring that eastern part of poetry back into
Sorry,
that.
Everyone.
No, it's fine. You didn't know, but now you do. I
literally said earlier about yelling at people online who get the things wrong, but I've been wrong this whole time. Am I a Karen? Oh no!
We get it, but we get like, that's the thing, is we get so rough. So, but I quite like when I don't know whether it's my brain fit in this, but you know, when you like, you've gone, oh, well, that fits quite well after the fact.
Yeah.
So it's like very briefly before I give my Villanelle, just like in terms of like a scenario, I think telling us more of a story than it possibly really could in the thing. So it's just go ahead, poem. If you could just write yourself, that would be super. and that sounds much later than Villanelle. That's day 7. So you're like, so even really early going, I like this weekly ability. And so I went for Villanelle because it's one of the ones we're going to be tackling this year. I also, last year's NaPoWriMo, I went crazy. I was going crazy. So this year I've gone crazy. So like, I'm excited for that. But I wanted to like do that thing where I went, I wrote a Villanelle before we even did it for Return to Form, and also as a weird accountability tool. It'll mean because now I'll have to do another one. We can compare the two and see if I've actually improved in 2 years. Who's excited to find out?
Woo!
This guy.
Let's go.
Let's go. So so I had a Villanelle, which I thought would be way easier because it's like 19 lines. I was like, sweet, 19 lines. Bash this out in an afternoon. So we'll get into more, obviously, the descriptives of what the Villanelle is later on, because I think it'll be more fun if I do it like raw.
What a great way to avoid responsibility of explaining the Villanelle, Gallie.
I know it follows the rules. I don't need to then explain
give it to us raw, Mark. It's fine.
Give it. So here we go. One bad day. That's all it takes for everything to slip away. Life led astray, mind finally breaks. One bad day. Did no one hear you pray? Do they not understand the stakes for everything to slip away, fallen through the gateway? Look and laugh at what it makes. One bad day. No black and white, only gray. No longer alone, their voices wake for everything to slip away. No point crying, it's time to play, whether internal mishap or mistake. One bad day for everything to slip away.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's crazy. You wrote that in a day.
So I did actually apparently bash that out in an afternoon, which is fun.
Great.
I like remember this because you did the post on Insta, right? And
I did our post on Insta. Joker. It's gone now. Wiped it away, but like it's gone. We've refreshed. But yeah, well, I heard Villanelle, saw villain, and went Joker. And so which I thought was like Villanelle, be able to tell that there are repeating lines, and I quite like that. You know, that definition of insanity, the same thing over and over for a different result. And so, you know, for one of those ones that doesn't necessarily get to make the set because you have to like go, I like Batman.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those ones where the form is more impressive than the poem, which is when you come back to like those crown sonnets. I'm like, must be so hard to like to do that and do it well, because you could do it, but like that's technically a thing, like that technically meets the criteria, but for it to then be, you know, good.
And that's the thing I think with Villanelle's, often it sounds very like you can tell when a form sounds contrived, where it's like they're writing just to hit the beat. Whereas like, again, it's an example I always think if you can read it fluidly like it's not in the form, then you've used the form successfully. And I think that is like a good example of it, where like if you didn't introduce that as a Villanelle, but you were doing, because you do a lot of like horror, it's
gone crazy
stuff, right?
guys.
Yeah you're a weird poet, Gallie. And so if you were doing that as part of like a longer like horror set, I don't think you would need to be like, this is a Villanelle about the Joker, you know what I mean? Or you know, if you were doing some sort of a thing that would be very interesting to see you do would be to do a series of videos or a series of like something like that, where it pairs into a singular horror story, where you take your existing horror poems and pair them into some sort of narrative that runs through, and do like some short edits for them all. Because I think that I would love to see you collaborate with Lewis Brown on it.
I would love nothing more than to collaborate.
So
He's so good at horror.
Just because I think there's something there of these like abstract pieces, and you write it so well. Like everything you do does have this very haunting tone. You get the pace and rhythm of that kind of horror, and like, not that there is one beat and rhythm to it, but you know what I mean, like whenever you hit it, you're pitch perfect in it, whether it's that kind of manic horror, the sort of more psychological, like weird turn, or something like this that is a more kind of trudging, almost feels like the Jason, following one bad day. It's like that mantra-esque thing. It's a fascinating genre of writing that not a lot of people do nowadays. Like a lot of people do funny poems, or a lot of people do like really sad poems. There's not a lot of people doing like scary poems.
I think it's because it's quite hard, like, not to say about, like, I think this is quite hard to do. It's why I love horror as a genre of the thing, because for me it's the pure, like, fear is the purest emotion, right? And I mean, show me we start crying, we're scared immediately, right? Yeah. It's, and to be able to, through an art form, make someone scared when they're not in a point of danger, I think is a very impressive and interesting thing to, like, you were watching a horror film on your own is a different experience than watching a horror film with your pals. But even just watching a film, you're very aware there's that divide, Video games maybe go a bit further by having you play in those first persons or getting those VR kind of horror games. Whereas I think it's it's quite hard to read a thing and be like, oh no. Yeah. Like to get dread or creep and those kind of things. That's obviously there are many horror writers that do it amazing.
Folk like Edgar Allan Poe or whatever, when you look at like poems, like the resonance that like his sort of horror work has still, because there's something like in certain rhythms and stuff. Like I watched a beautiful YouTube video that like broke down why Edgar Allan Poe's like rhythm is scary. Like I would love to see you do something like that with the Gallie, and that's like a really, that when you say that piece isn't necessarily usable, it depends the context.
Well, whenever you got time, if you can find some time to start making that would be great. And obviously we'll discuss Villanelles in much more depth in next week's episode of the NaPodcast. But before we wrap up, we have to properly set this challenge, which means we need to go to Dr. Katie Ailes' poetry cupboard for a definition on the Villanelle and what you need to do to have written one. Take it away, Dr. Katie Ailes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my poetry cupboard. If you watched any of the videos that I've released in the last 2 years, they're all filmed in this cupboard. It's where my knowledge lives, not in here. Nope. So what is a villanelle? Essentially, Mark's poem laid it out quite nicely, but it is a 19-line long poem. It has origins in Italian peasant songs, Italian working songs, but was sort of codified as a French form. I talk more about the history of it in my workshop, which we will absolutely be linking in the description below.
Basically, I didn't have that workshop. Just keep that in mind, everyone. I didn't have that workshop. I didn't have that workshop when I wrote that.
Giving you the cheat codes there.
Yeah.
So there are sort of two main aspects of the villanelle. The first is the repeated lines. So you have 2 lines which repeat 4 times each over the course of the poem. They appear, both lines appear in the first and last stanzas, and then one of the refrains in each of the other stanzas. It is a 6-stanza long form with 5 tercets, 5 3-line long stanzas, and then a concluding quatrain, a concluding 4-line long stanza. So the repeated lines is one aspect of it. The other aspect is the rhyme scheme. So there are only 2 rhyme sounds used in the villanelle. So in Mark's, you saw that it was day, day and away. For the refrains rhyme with each other, and then the breaks sound, break, ache, take, was the other rhyme sound in his. So you only have 2 end rhyme sounds that you're able to use, your A and your B rhymes. Again, I'm going over this all quite quickly. You can watch my workshop for the full explanation of everything.
Or this video at half speed.
Or this video at half speed. Yeah, exactly.
I would recommend the workshop personally.
A little bit slower and clearer.
I think so.
The other aspect of it, so you have these refrains, right? And you have a bit of flexibility in the form, and that you're able to tweak the refrains slightly throughout the poem as you go. So this is something that's used by quite a lot of famous villanelles. For instance, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop uses it in the final line. the art of losing isn't hard to master is one of the refrains in that, which she tweaks in the final line. So definitely do check out the Villanelles that A.R. Crow and Nadine Aisha Jassett wrote for last season of Return to Form, as they're really fantastic examples of the form. And yeah, my main advice for writing a Villanelle, it is a puzzle. It is a lot of planning. It's one of the hardest forms that I have ever worked with. But it is so valuable and so worthwhile. So I would suggest really taking your time with it, going step by step, taking it slow. It is not a form I would recommend trying to do in an afternoon. And give yourself time, and also to think really clearly about how, when you're choosing the theme of your poem, how that is going to reflect sort of the circularity and the refrain of the Villanelle, as Marx does, the one bad day, you keep returning to the one bad day and what it causes, right? For instance, Crow's Villanelle for Return to Form was about sort of lockdown and the weird liminal space it put us all in, and the sort of repetition of everything and how it sort of felt never ending. So thinking about things that repeat or things that sort of seem like they're stuck in a loop, that's good subject matter for a Villanelle. So yeah, this has been Katie's Poetry Cupboard.
Thank you, Dr. Katie Ailes, for reporting from the cupboard. Obviously, as Katie said, this is a difficult form. It is a bit of a challenge. We have only a week to do it. So, but don't worry, we're not leaving you high and dry out on your own. If you are new to poetry, want a bit of a refresher, maybe you're like me and only ever write NaPoWriMo, so you need to remember how to do it. We also have our fabulous form fundamentals as part of Return to Form Season 2. They are all linked down below, but you're going to really want to look at structure, rhyme, kind of all of them are going to really help through the Villanelle and the challenges we have upcoming. Also linked below, we have our workshop videos and for each form, and the inspiration that we have here with A.R. Crow and Nadine Aisha Jassett. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Jassett. Yeah, I just to briefly butt in there again. One thing, you'll see that a lot of traditional villanelles are written in iambic pentameter. I would say that is optional. Sorry, it's either pentameter or tetrameter. I get
and I know what I will be opting for.
Yeah, so you can do, if you want the challenge, you don't have to.
Mm-hmm. So if you are wanting to take on these challenges with us, please do. We would love to see your work. Keep in touch with us on Twitter, on Instagram. If you have something you'd like us to share in our shows, we would love to share your work. Please send it to us and let us know that it's okay for us to shout you out. And then just keep in touch. We'll be posting up on Instagram and Twitter, getting stressed about having to write poetry and form. And if you want to hang out with us in real life on Monday, tomorrow, we have our fabulous March open mic at the Kilderkin in Edinburgh. You are welcome to come along. Details are down below. If you can't make that one, then we also have 2 shows next month in Edinburgh and in Aberdeen on the 15th and 16th of April, respectively. Again, all the details are down below. We've got some amazing lineups for our shows for this year. It's going to be super sweet.
Bangers.
All bangers. It's been really good. And if you want to keep up to date with everything that we're doing, sign up for our newsletter. It's a really good one for April. I've been spending a lot of time crafting it. So sign up to that, keep in touch with us. And otherwise, we will see you online and next week to discuss our villanelles. Everyone say goodbye.
Goodbye. Good luck.